Hi everyone, my name is Melissa van Dijk, and in this video I want to show you how I think this confusion around the amount of sodium you actually need is getting created. And I think a lot of it simply comes from the way these recommendations are written. Because the way we usually do this is that we go on Google or whatever search engine or AI you are using and type in what you want to know. So for example, you type in sodium requirement per day. And then you usually get one of these AI summaries, and it tells you something like ideal healthy goal 1500 milligrams per day. So what are you supposed to think? If I'm literally asking how much sodium I require and you tell me that my ideal goal is 1500 milligrams per day, of course I can read that as, okay, this is roughly what I should be getting every day. And I would imagine a lot of you stop right there. Because these days we are just so used to not opening every source and carefully reading through the entire page, which can of course easily be exploited. But the result is that you read the summary, get the number you were looking for, and then just move on. But if you actually click on the source, which is in this case the American Heart Association, then you start to see where the confusion is coming from. Because on their own website, they tell you that there's no reliable evidence that eating less than 1500 milligrams per day is a risk for most people. And then they say that the body actually needs less than 500 milligrams of sodium per day to function properly. They even explain that healthy kidneys are very good at retaining the sodium your body needs. Okay, good. So now you think, okay, the body actually needs very little sodium. But then immediately after that, they start talking about this 1500 milligrams guideline again and say that it may not apply to competitive athletes or people who lose large amounts of sodium through sweat, such as people working under major heat stress. So again, if you're just reading this normally, what are you supposed to think? You could very easily come away thinking, okay, maybe I need around 1500 milligrams, and if I exercise, live somewhere hot or sweat a lot, I probably need even more. Because most of us exercise to some degree, right? Or maybe you have a demanding job, you live somewhere hot, or you simply sweat a lot. So most people can probably see themselves somewhere in there. Especially if you're a bit more anxious or cautious about these things and you don't really talk about it with your friends or relatives because it feels personal, you know. So it becomes incredibly easy to think that somehow you are included. And then you think, well, I probably need around 1500 milligrams a day, maybe even a bit more just to be safe. But that is not what they actually mean. The American Heart Association itself describes 1500 milligrams as an optimal goal of no more than 1500 milligrams. And elsewhere it calls it an ideal limit. It is not saying that your body requires 1500 milligrams and that you should work your way toward that number. And that is exactly why I think this wording needs to change. Because if you tell somebody that their ideal goal is 1500 milligrams, naturally they can interpret that as something they should try to reach. And then Google takes that wording and gives you ideal heart healthy goal 1500 milligrams per day. So Google did not just invent this confusion out of nowhere either. It is summarizing information that is already written in a confusing way at the source. Whether that is intentional, whether it is simply badly written, or whether everybody is trying so hard to cover every possible exception that the message becomes meaningless, I don't know, but the result is the same. People can end up consuming way more sodium every single day because they think these numbers are amounts they need to reach. And then everybody wonders why there's so much misinformation circulating. And the other thing that makes this even stranger is our modern food supply. Because once you actually start eating real, unprocessed or minimally processed whole foods, you realize how difficult it is to naturally reach these kinds of numbers. From what I have tried myself, even 1000 milligrams can be difficult to reach just by eating real foods. You really need to include things naturally higher in sodium, like a lot of mussels or seaweed, which many people probably don't eat anyway. And just to give you an example, on my own whole food days, when I eat the food as it comes and maybe add a pinch of salt here and there, I usually end up somewhere around 400 to 800 milligrams per day. And I mean, even the American Heart Association itself says that more than 70% of the sodium Americans eat comes from packaged, prepared and restaurant foods, rather than the salt shaker. So once you start eating bread, sauces, cheese, noodles, ready-made meals, and all the other processed foods you may be eating throughout the day, suddenly reaching 1,500 milligrams is not really difficult at all. I mean, many people are already getting this just with breakfast these days. And I think that is really the bigger problem, because the modern food supply has become completely out of sync with our biology. The modern industry has essentially completely fucked it up. And now we are stuck in this system where we keep trying to correct the problems it creates while somehow still making the whole thing sound believable. So it's really a massive systemic issue at this point. But if these organizations are genuinely trying to help people, which I still think they do, then I think the wording needs to become much clearer. Otherwise, they become part of the problem, maybe even unknowingly. And I mean, if somebody then chooses to eat more sodium, that is entirely like a different story. Everyone can do what they want, but at least people should understand what these numbers actually mean so they can decide for themselves. Because I think probably many of you watching this simply didn't know, and you have been treating numbers like 1,500 milligrams as a target all this time. Because that is what I assumed myself until very recently. And that may be one of the reasons why reducing your sodium intake has not been working. Because you constantly thought, well, I'm in the correct range with 1,500 or 2,300 milligrams. So really, you only need a few hundred milligrams of sodium a day. That is the number you should be thinking about. And 1,500 milligrams is not something you should be trying to reach at all. It is a limit you want to stay well below, not a goal. So I hope that this could clarify things. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!